The evening meal at Fort Stevens carried the familiar rhythm of 500 soldiers winding down from another day of training. Lieutenant Kira Brennan moved through the serving line with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago not to draw attention. She accepted her tray from the mess staff, offered a brief nod of thanks, and scanned the crowded hall for an empty seat near the back corner. At 26, she had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, competent without being remarkable, exceptional without being celebrated. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have military bases in your area or family members who served. The clatter of trays and low hum of conversation filled the space as Kira settled at a table with 3 other junior officers she knew by name, but not by friendship. She had kept that distance deliberately, maintained it carefully over the 18 months since her assignment to Fort Stevens. They nodded their greetings, and she returned them with the same measured courtesy that marked all her interactions on base. Private Chun across the table was recounting some story about the afternoon's vehicle maintenance disaster, his hands animated as he described hydraulic fluid spraying across the motor pool. Lieutenant Morrison laughed, nearly choking on his water, while Sergeant Okafor shook her head in amused disbelief. Kira smiled at appropriate moments, offered brief comments when addressed directly, but kept herself slightly apart from the easy camaraderie that came so naturally to others. It was not that she disliked her fellow soldiers. In truth, she respected most of them deeply, had served alongside several in difficult training exercises where their character revealed itself under pressure. But friendship required sharing, and sharing required truth, and truth was the one thing Kira could not afford at Fort Stevens. The mess hall doors opened again, and a subtle shift rippled through the room. Conversations did not stop exactly, but they modulated, became slightly more measured. Postures straightened almost imperceptibly. Kira felt it before she saw the cause, that instinctive awareness soldiers develop when command enters a space. General Marcus Holloway moved through the mess hall with the unhurried confidence of a man who had earned every star on his shoulder through 3 decades of service. At 52, his presence still commanded attention without demanding it. He was not a tall man, but something in the way he carried himself made people straighten their spines when he passed. His evening walk thrusts were rare enough to be noteworthy, common enough not to cause alarm. Kira's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, willing herself to remain still, to not make the mistake of drawing his attention through sudden movement. Her table mates had gone quiet, watching the general make his way between the rows of tables, pausing here and there to speak briefly with soldiers. He asked about training, about equipment, about families back home. His questions were genuine, his attention focused. He remembered names, remembered details from previous conversations. It was one of the things that made him exceptional as a commander. It was also one of the things that made his presence dangerous for Kira. She kept her head down, focused on her meal, tracking his progress through the hall by the shifting pattern of voices around her. He was 3 tables away, then 2. She calculated angles, exit routes, the likelihood of being able to finish her meal and leave before he reached her section. The odds were not favorable. Morrison leaned slightly toward her, voice low. He asked if she had heard about the upcoming training exercise, the big multi-unit simulation scheduled for next week. Kira nodded, grateful for the distraction, and offered some observation about the terrain conditions in the northern training range. Her voice remained steady, professional, giving nothing away of the tension coiling in her chest. The general was 1 table away now. Kira could hear his voice clearly, asking a corporal about his recent promotion, congratulating him on the achievement. The corporal stammered something grateful in response, clearly unused to such direct attention from command. General Holloway said something about maintaining standards, about earned respect, mattering more than given rank. His words carried the weight of someone who believed deeply in merit, in proving worth through action rather than assumption. Kira's hands tightened slightly on her fork. She knew those beliefs, had been raised on them, had watched them shape every decision of her childhood until the day they had shattered her family into pieces too sharp to put back together. 8 years ago, those same beliefs had driven her from her father's house, had convinced her that the only way to honor what he had taught her was to become what he had forbidden her to be. The memory surfaced unbidden as Kira pushed food around her plate, still tracking the general's movements through the mess hall. She was 18 again, standing in the kitchen of her childhood home, acceptance letter from the Army recruiting office clutched in her hand. The paper had felt like victory and vindication, like everything she had worked toward since she first understood what her father's uniform meant. Her mother had been at the sink, hands frozen in dishwater, face pale. She had known what was coming, had seen the tension building for months as Kira prepared her application in secret. Her father had been in his study, reviewing some report or briefing, and Kira had waited until dinner to make her announcement. She had wanted them both present, had believed somehow that her mother's support would shield her from his reaction. She had been wrong. Marcus Holloway had set down his fork with careful precision, the same controlled movement Kira recognized now in her own mannerisms. He had asked her to repeat what she said, though they both knew he had heard perfectly. His voice had been level, almost conversational, but Kira had spent 18 years learning to read the warning signs in his tone. She had repeated it, told him she had enlisted, that she would ship out for basic training in 6 weeks, that she was going to serve just as he had, just as his father had, just as 3 generations of Holloways had before her. She had thought invoking that legacy would matter, would make him see that she was honoring rather than rejecting everything he had taught her. Instead, he had told her no. Not asked, not suggested, not discussed. Simply stated that she would not be going, would not be throwing her life away, would not be placing herself in harm's way for some misguided notion of patriotism. The Army was not a place for his daughter. She would attend college as planned, would pursue something safe, something that would not end with a folded flag and empty promises about honor and sacrifice. Kira had argued, reminded him of every lesson he had taught her about duty and service, about standing up for what mattered, about protecting those who could not protect themselves. She had thrown his own words back at him, every speech about the nobility of military service, every story about the bonds forged in combat, every principle he had lived by for 30 years. Her mother had tried to intervene, had placed a hand on Marcus's arm and suggested they discuss this calmly. That Kira was an adult now and deserved to make her own choices. That had been the moment the argument transformed into something uglier, when Marcus had turned on his wife and asked if she had encouraged this, if she had been supporting Kira's plans behind his back. The fight that followed had exposed cracks in her parents' marriage that Kira had been too young or too naive to notice before. Her mother's resentment at following Marcus from base to base, at raising a daughter in the shadow of his career. His frustration at what he saw as her failure to understand the importance of his work. Their fundamental disagreement about what they wanted for their daughter's future. At some point during the shouting, Kira had made her choice. She had left the kitchen, climbed the stairs to her room, and begun packing. Her mother had followed, tears streaming, begging her not to do anything rash. Her father had remained in the kitchen, rigid with fury, issuing his ultimatum through the walls. If she walked out that door to pursue this path, she was choosing the Army over her family. She would not be welcome back. Kira had taken her mother's maiden name the next day, Brennan instead of Holloway. It had been her mother's suggestion during those awful hours after the fight, offered between sobs as she helped Kira pack. If Marcus would not support this choice, would not even try to understand, then Kira would build her military career without the weight of his name. She would prove herself on her own merit, without any assumptions about legacy or nepotism. The divorce papers had been filed 3 months later. Her mother had blamed herself, had told Kira in late-night phone calls that the fight over enlistment had simply revealed problems that had existed for years. But Kira knew better. She had been the catalyst, the breaking point, the issue that neither parent could compromise on. The briefing room buzzed with activity the following morning as officers gathered for the announcement of the upcoming training exercise. Kira arrived early, claiming a seat near the middle of the room, where she could observe without being conspicuous. She had her notebook ready, pen positioned, every outward sign of an engaged officer prepared to absorb mission details. Captain Derek Randolph entered with his usual swagger, medals precisely aligned on his chest, posture suggesting he owned whatever space he occupied. At 41, he had spent 2 decades in the Army and wore his experience like armor against any suggestion that the service might be changing around him. He had opinions about those changes, opinions he shared freely with anyone in earshot. He took the seat directly in front of Kira, turned to Lieutenant Grayson beside him, and began holding forth about the exercise parameters he had heard through unofficial channels. His voice carried deliberately, meant to be overheard by the junior officers surrounding him. He mentioned something about mixed unit compositions, about the integration requirements Command was implementing, about how real combat did not care about diversity quotas. Kira kept her expression neutral, continued reviewing the blank page in her notebook. She had served under officers like Randolph before, had learned that engaging with their provocations only validated their need to make them. Excellence was the only argument that mattered, the only response that could not be dismissed or deflected. The briefing officer called the room to attention as Colonel Patterson entered, followed by several senior staff members. Everyone rose, held position until released, then settled back in his seats with the rustling efficiency of disciplined soldiers. Patterson moved to the front of the room, pulled up the presentation on the main screen, and began outlining the exercise objectives. Operation Iron Resolve would span 5 days across the northern training ranges, involving elements from 4 different battalions in complex combined arms scenarios. The exercise was designed to test tactical flexibility, inter-unit coordination, and adaptive decision-making under rapidly changing conditions. Each team would face unexpected complications, simulated equipment failures, and evolving enemy positions requiring real-time adjustment of plans. Kira listened intently, already mapping terrain in her mind, considering logistics, identifying potential choke points and defensive advantages. It was instinctive now, this constant tactical analysis, pattern recognition, honed through years of studying everything her father had ever published about combat operations. She had read his papers, his after-action reports, anything she could access through military databases, had taught herself to think like him even as she built her career apart from him. Patterson continued through the exercise structure, explaining the team compositions. 12 mixed units, each led by a senior officer with a junior officer as second-in-command. The explicit goal was to evaluate leadership potential at multiple levels, to identify officers who could maintain effectiveness under pressure while managing diverse skill sets and perspectives. The team assignments appeared on screen. Kira scanned the list, found her name paired with Captain Randolph. She kept her face carefully blank, allowed no reaction to show despite the sinking sensation in her chest. Of all the possible assignments, this was among the worst. Randolph had made his views about women in combat roles abundantly clear on multiple occasions. Being placed under his direct command for 5 days of high-pressure evaluation felt less like opportunity and more like trial by fire. Randolph turned slightly in his seat, glanced back at her with an expression that mixed satisfaction and challenge. He said nothing, but his smirk conveyed everything. He would be watching, judging, waiting for any mistake he could use to validate his assumptions about female officers in infantry positions. The briefing concluded with standard reminders about safety protocols, communication procedures, and evaluation criteria. Officers were dismissed to begin preparation with their assigned teams. Kira gathered her materials, prepared to approach Randolph and establish working parameters for the exercise, when she noticed General Holloway entering through the back door of the briefing room. He must have been observing from the rear, standing rather than sitting, maintaining that command presence even during routine briefings. Colonel Patterson moved to greet him, brief exchange passing between them. The general's eyes swept the room as officers filed out, cataloging faces, making mental notes in that way senior commanders did when evaluating their subordinates. His gaze passed over Kira without pause, without recognition, just another lieutenant among dozens serving under his command. She felt the familiar mixture of relief and ache, grateful to remain anonymous while mourning the distance that anonymity represented. She moved with the flow of officers toward the exit, careful not to draw attention through either hurry or hesitation. Randolph caught up with her in the corridor outside, fell in a step beside her with that proprietary air he adopted whenever claiming command of a situation. He told her they would meet that afternoon to review team composition and begin tactical planning. His tone suggested this was generous of him, allowing his second-in-command input on strategy. Kira acknowledged the directive with professional courtesy, confirmed the time and location, gave him no ammunition for complaint. Dawn broke cold and clear over the northern training range as Operation Iron Resolve commenced. Kira stood with her assigned squad, 12 soldiers checking equipment and reviewing final briefings while Captain Randolph consulted his tactical maps with exaggerated concentration. The air carried that particular tension that preceded combat exercises, when training became serious enough to matter but controlled enough to learn from mistakes. Their objective for the first phase was straightforward on paper. Advance through a simulated hostile zone, secure a defensive position on elevated terrain, and maintain communication with adjacent units while responding to evolving scenario conditions. Simple in concept, complex in execution, especially with a squad that had never worked together as a cohesive unit before. Randolph gathered them for his opening briefing, spreading the map across the hood of their transport vehicle. He outlined his approach with the confidence of someone who believed years of service automatically translated to superior judgment. His plan called for a direct advance along the main access road, speed over stealth, overwhelming any simulated resistance through aggressive movement and superior firepower. Kira studied the map while he spoke, noting the obvious vulnerabilities in his approach. The main road offered multiple ambush points, narrow passages where a defending force could inflict maximum damage on an advancing column. The alternative route through the western tree line would take longer, but provided natural cover and multiple fallback positions if they encountered unexpected resistance. She waited until Randolph finished his briefing, then suggested the alternative approach in the most neutral tone she could manage. She framed it as a question rather than a challenge, asked if he had considered the exposure risk along the primary route given the terrain features clearly marked on the map. Randolph glanced at her with barely concealed irritation, then dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. He stated that speed was essential, that hesitation and overthinking had cost more missions than bold action ever had, that the Army needed officers willing to take initiative rather than hide behind caution. Several squad members shifted uncomfortably, caught between their second-in-command raising valid tactical concerns and their commanding officer shutting down discussion. They moved out according to Randolph's plan. Kira took her position in the formation, kept her communications professional, made mental adjustments to compensate for the vulnerabilities she had identified. If they encountered resistance at the predicted choke points, she would need to adapt quickly, redirect the squad without undermining Randolph's authority more than absolutely necessary for their safety. 3 miles into the advance, the first ambush came exactly where Kira had anticipated. Simulated explosions erupted from concealed positions along the ridgeline, exercise controllers marking 3 squad members as casualties in the opening seconds. Randolph shouted orders to return fire and push through, but the simulated enemy had positioned themselves perfectly to make that approach suicidal. Kira assessed the situation in seconds. She called out alternative positions to the remaining squad members, directing them to covered locations while maintaining fields of fire. Her voice carried calm authority, the product of countless hours studying tactical responses to ambush scenarios. The soldiers responded instinctively, recognizing competent leadership when survival instincts demanded it. Randolph continued issuing contradictory orders, insisting they advance directly into the kill zone. Kira countermanded him as gently as possible, phrasing it as adjusting timing rather than changing strategy, but the squad understood what was happening. They followed her directions, used suppressive fire to cover movement to better positions, gradually extracted themselves from the ambush without taking additional casualties. 2 miles north in the observation tower, General Holloway watched the engagement unfold through high-powered optics and real-time tactical displays. He had positioned himself to oversee multiple teams simultaneously, evaluating leadership under pressure across the entire exercise area. His attention kept returning to Team 7, drawn by something in their movement patterns that spoke of training beyond the standard curriculum. Colonel Patterson stood beside him, providing commentary on each team's performance. He noted Team 7's recovery from the ambush, commended their tactical flexibility, mentioned that Captain Randolph commanded that unit. General Holloway nodded absently, but his focus remained on the figure directing fire and movement from the center of the formation. The second in command, he realized, watching how the squad oriented toward that position rather than toward Randolph. He asked Patterson for the roster information on Team 7. The colonel pulled it up on his tablet, read off the names and ranks. Lieutenant Kira Brennan, serving as second in command. Strong service record, recent transfer from Fort Campbell, consistently high marks in tactical training and leadership evaluations. General Holloway filed the name away, continued watching as Team 7 completed their extraction and regrouped to continue their mission. On the ground, Kira coordinated with her squad to assess their situation. 3 simulated casualties meant reduced capability for the remainder of the mission. Randolph insisted they proceed with the original objective despite their reduced numbers. Kira privately calculated their actual capacity, began formulating backup plans for scenarios where they encountered additional resistance without sufficient personnel to execute standard tactics. The terrain grew more challenging as Team 7 pushed deeper into the exercise area. Rocky outcroppings replaced open ground, forcing single-file movement through narrow passages where visibility dropped to mere meters. Kira maintained constant awareness of their position relative to other units, tracking friendly forces through radio updates while scanning for signs of the next simulated threat. Randolph led from the front, setting a punishing pace that seemed designed more to prove his physical stamina than to maintain tactical awareness. The squad struggled to keep formation, their reduced numbers making it difficult to maintain proper spacing and overlapping fields of fire. Kira moved through the column, quietly adjusting positions, ensuring no critical gaps appeared in their defensive coverage. Sergeant Torres, one of the more experienced squad members, caught her eye as she passed. He tilted his head slightly toward Randolph's position ahead, raised an eyebrow in silent question about their commander's judgment. Kira gave the smallest shake of her head, a gesture that said maintain discipline without endorsing criticism. Torres nodded understanding, passed the sentiment along to the soldiers near him through glances and subtle positioning. The radio crackled with reports from other teams. Team 3 had secured their objective, but taken heavy, simulated casualties in the process. Team 9 requested medical evacuation for wounded, testing the exercise's emergency response protocols. Team 11 reported contact with simulated enemy forces in the eastern sector, requesting fire support that would not be coming. Each team learning hard lessons about resource management and tactical adaptation. General Holloway listened to the same reports from his observation position, tracking each team's progress on the tactical display. His staff officers provided running commentary, noting successful tactics and questionable decisions. But the general's attention kept drifting back to Team 7, watching how they moved through terrain, how they responded to their commander's choices, how leadership seemed to flow from unexpected sources. He asked his aide to pull up Lieutenant Brennan's complete service file. The aide complied quickly, handing over a tablet with her records displayed. General Holloway scrolled through the information methodically. Born in Virginia, enlisted at 18 under her mother's name, exemplary basic training performance, rapid advancement through infantry school, commendations for tactical thinking, leadership potential, ability to remain calm under pressure. Recent transfer to Fort Stevens at her own request. Something about the timeline nagged at him. He did the math in his head, calculated when she would have enlisted, where she might have grown up if her mother was military connected. The pieces did not quite fit together, but the shape of them felt familiar in ways he could not immediately identify. On the ground, Team 7 reached their assigned objective point, a ridgeline offering commanding views of the valley below. Randolph ordered immediate defensive positions, hasty rather than deliberate, prioritizing speed of establishment over optimized fields of fire. Kira supplemented his orders quietly, suggesting minor adjustments that significantly improved their defensive coverage without openly contradicting his plan. The squad worked efficiently, each soldier understanding their role, covering each other as they established fighting positions and communication points. Specialist Kim set up the radio equipment, established contact with command, reported their successful arrival at the objective. Corporal Whitmore organized ammunition distribution, ensured each position had adequate supplies for sustained engagement. Kira moved between positions, checking sight lines, confirming interlocking fire zones, mentally cataloging vulnerabilities that might need adjustment if they face serious assault. She noticed Randolph watching her with open hostility, resenting her competence, her quiet authority with the squad, the way soldiers looked to her for confirmation even after receiving his orders. He called her over to his command position, voice sharp with irritation. He told her that he was in command of this unit, that her role was to support his decisions, not undermine them, that the squad needed to see unified leadership, not competing authorities. His words technically addressed legitimate command concerns, but his tone revealed wounded ego more than tactical necessity. Kira acknowledged his points professionally, agreed that unity of command was essential, offered no defense that might escalate the confrontation. She understood what he wanted: validation and deference, acknowledgement of his superior rank and experience. She gave him the words while knowing the squad had already made their own assessments about whose judgment they trusted when situations became critical. The exercise controllers injected the next complication just as Team 7 finished their defensive preparations. New intelligence indicated simulated enemy forces massing for assault on their position in significantly greater numbers than anticipated. Additional friendly units that were supposed to reinforce them had been redirected to other sectors. Team 7 would need to hold alone or execute tactical withdrawal to avoid being overwhelmed. Randolph studied the updated situation with visible frustration. He had expected a straightforward defense, demonstrating his ability to organize and maintain a static position. The changing scenario demanded adaptation, creative thinking, willingness to abandon the original plan if circumstances required it. These were not his strengths. The simulated enemy forces appeared on the horizon exactly when the exercise controllers had predicted, a substantial force moving with coordinated precision that suggested professional opposition force training. Randolph ordered the squad to prepare for sustained defense, insisting they could hold the position regardless of numerical disadvantage. His voice carried forced confidence that failed to conceal his uncertainty about how to actually execute that defense. Kira assessed the situation with the cold calculation her father had taught her years ago, back when she was young enough to sit at his knee while he explained tactical principles using chess pieces and topographic maps. The position was good, but not designed for the force ratio they now faced. Their reduced squad lacked sufficient personnel to maintain defensive depth while covering all approaches. Static defense would result in simulated annihilation within minutes of contact. She approached Randolph carefully, kept her voice low enough that the squad could not overhear. She suggested they implement a fighting withdrawal, using the terrain to their advantage, forcing the enemy to pursue through channeled approaches where superior numbers became liability rather than asset. They could fall back through prepared positions, inflicting casualties at each stage, potentially linking up with other friendly units in more defensible terrain. Randolph rejected her proposal immediately, his voice rising enough that several squad members turned to watch the exchange. He stated that they had been ordered to secure this position, that withdrawal without direct authorization would constitute failure, that officers who abandoned assigned objectives demonstrated weakness that had no place in combat leadership. His words targeted her specifically, questioning her resolve, her commitment, her fitness for command responsibility. The squad shifted uncomfortably, caught between tactical reality and command hierarchy. They could see the approaching forces, could calculate the impossible mathematics of 9 soldiers against 40, could recognize that their second-in-command offered a viable alternative to certain defeat. But Randolph held rank, held authority, held the power to damage careers and reputations. Kira made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She acknowledged Randolph's authority, then turned to the squad and began issuing orders that subtly repositioned them for withdrawal rather than static defense. She framed it as adjusting fields of fire, improving coverage, creating layered defensive positions. But Sergeant Torres understood immediately, caught her eye, and gave the smallest nod of comprehension. The simulated engagement began with mortar fire, exercise controllers marking impact zones with smoke grenades and acoustic simulators. Randolph shouted orders to return fire, to hold positions, to maintain the defensive line. Kira continued directing movement between positions, extracting soldiers from untenable locations, establishing fallback points that looked like defensive depth but actually created escape routes. In the observation tower, General Holloway leaned forward, completely focused on Team 7's situation. He watched the lieutenant orchestrating movement with surgical precision, recognizing the tactical pattern even as it unfolded. She was executing a textbook fighting withdrawal while maintaining the appearance of following her commander's orders. It was brilliant and insubordinate in equal measure, the kind of decision that saved lives in real combat and ended careers in peacetime evaluation. Colonel Patterson voiced concern about Team 7's cohesion, noting the apparent disconnect between the captain's orders and the actual squad movements. General Holloway said nothing, continued watching, waiting to see how the situation resolved. He had seen countless officers face similar challenges, the tension between following orders and making correct tactical decisions. Most chose one path or the other. Few possessed the skill to walk both simultaneously. The simulated enemy closed to engagement range, opposition force trainers executing their assault with professional competence. Team 7 responded with disciplined fire, each soldier covering specific sectors while maintaining awareness of fallback positions. Randolph remained focused on his original plan, seemed genuinely surprised when soldiers began withdrawing to secondary positions without his explicit authorization. Kira maintained calm throughout the chaos, her voice steady on the radio as she coordinated movement and fire. She pulled the squad back through 3 successive positions, each withdrawal covered by elements already established in the next defensible location. They inflicted significant simulated casualties on the pursuing force, using terrain and tactics to multiply their effectiveness beyond their actual numbers. Specialist Kim transmitted updates to command, reporting their fighting withdrawal in language that made it sound like tactical adjustment rather than abandonment of position. The exercise controllers observed and recorded, making notes about leadership dynamics and decision-making under pressure. This scenario would generate extensive discussion in after-action reviews. Randolph finally recognized what was happening, that his squad had executed a complete withdrawal while he maintained the fiction of holding their original position. His face flushed with anger, but the tactical situation left no room for confrontation. They were in contact with the enemy, moving through hostile terrain, dependent on coordination for survival, even in this simulated context. The formal hearing convened 3 days after Operation Iron Resolve concluded. Captain Randolph had filed his complaint within hours of the exercise ending, citing multiple instances of insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and undermining of command authority. The charges were serious enough to warrant official inquiry, public enough that junior officers throughout Fort Stevens knew the details before Kira received formal notification. She sat in the small anteroom outside the hearing chamber, uniform perfectly pressed, posture relaxed despite the tension coiling in her chest. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez had stopped by earlier, offered quiet words of encouragement that felt weighted with meaning Kira could not quite interpret. The older woman had served at Fort Stevens for nearly 2 decades, had seen commanders come and go, had witnessed the full spectrum of leadership success and failure. The hearing board consisted of 3 senior officers, with General Holloway presiding as the ranking authority. Standard protocol for allegations against officers required impartial evaluation by those with sufficient experience to understand both tactical necessity and command structure. Kira understood the irony of her father, sitting in judgment of decisions she had learned by studying his own tactical writings. She entered when called, moved to the designated position facing the board, stood at attention until directed to be seated. The room felt smaller than its actual dimensions, walls pressing in with the weight of military justice and career-defining consequences. Randolph sat across the chamber with his counsel, expression mixing righteous certainty and wounded pride. Colonel Patterson opened the proceedings, outlined the specific allegations, confirmed that all parties understood the process and their rights within it. His tone remained professionally neutral, giving no indication of his personal opinions about the case. The board would review evidence, hear testimony, and render judgment based solely on facts and applicable regulations. Randolph presented his case first, describing the exercise sequence with emphasis on each instance where Kira had countermanded or modified his orders. He characterized her actions as systematic undermining of his authority, suggesting she had decided from the outset that she knew better than her commanding officer. His narrative painted her as arrogant, insubordinate, dangerously independent in situations requiring unified command. He presented radio transcripts showing her issuing orders without his authorization, tactical logs documenting squad movements that deviated from his plan, testimony from exercise controllers who had observed the disconnect between his stated intentions and actual unit actions. The evidence appeared damning when presented through his interpretive lens, each data point supporting his conclusion that she had effectively assumed command without proper authority. Kira listened without reaction, taking notes on points she would need to address, maintaining the professional composure she had cultivated throughout her service. She felt General Holloway's attention on her periodically, assessing her demeanor, evaluating how she handled pressure and accusation. She gave him nothing to read, no emotional response to exploit or use as evidence of instability. When her turn came to respond, Kira stood and approached the evidence display. She requested permission to present her tactical analysis of the situation to demonstrate why each decision had been necessary for mission success and squad survival. Colonel Patterson granted permission, curiosity evident despite his neutral expression. She began with the initial ambush, displayed the terrain analysis she had conducted before the mission, showed the predicted danger zones that Randolph had dismissed. The exercise recordings confirmed her assessment, demonstrated that the ambush occurred exactly where she had anticipated. Her immediate tactical response had extracted the squad with minimal additional casualties, textbook execution of ambush reaction drills. She moved through each subsequent decision point methodically, presenting the tactical situation as it existed in real time, the available options given their resources and circumstances, the likely outcomes of different approaches. Her analysis was clinical, detailed, supported by doctrine and historical precedent. She cited specific field manuals, reference case studies from actual combat operations, demonstrated that every choice aligned with established tactical principles. The board members leaned forward, engaged despite their obligation to remain impartial. General Holloway asked pointed questions, testing her reasoning, probing for gaps in her tactical logic. She answered each query with precision that came from years of studying exactly these scenarios, from absorbing lessons her father had published about decision-making under pressure. She addressed the fighting withdrawal specifically, acknowledged that it deviated from Randolph's stated plan, then presented the mathematics of the situation. 9 soldiers against 40 in prepared positions meant complete simulated destruction within minutes. The withdrawal preserved combat effectiveness, inflicted significant casualties on the opposing force, achieved the underlying mission objective of denying enemy freedom of movement even while surrendering the specific geographic position. Randolph interjected, arguing that she had exceeded her authority regardless of outcome, that good results did not justify violation of command structure. Kira acknowledged his point calmly, agreed that hierarchy mattered, then asked the board to consider what they would expect of officers in actual combat facing similar circumstances. The hearing extended into its third hour as Kira continued her tactical presentation. She had requested permission to show the complete mission recordings with synchronized tactical overlay, demonstrating in real time how each decision connected to observable conditions on the ground. The board granted the request, understanding that such comprehensive analysis would provide clarity that fragmented testimony could not. The recordings played on the main display, multiple camera angles from squad members and observation posts stitched together into coherent narrative. Kira narrated key moments, paused at critical decision points, explained her reasoning in language that balanced technical precision with accessible explanation. She never claimed perfection, acknowledged moments where alternative approaches might have worked, but demonstrated systematic tactical thinking throughout. General Holloway watched the recordings with intense focus, seeing patterns in her movement that triggered something in his memory. The way she positioned soldiers for overlapping fields of fire, the specific intervals she used for spacing during movement, the hand signals she employed for silent communication. These were not generic tactical choices, but specific methodologies, refined approaches that came from particular schools of thought about infantry combat. He found himself formulating questions before consciously deciding to ask them, probing deeper into her tactical education. He asked where she had learned to execute fighting withdrawals with such precision, what doctrine she followed when calculating force ratios and engagement distances, whose theories informed her approach to tactical decision-making under uncertainty. Kira answered carefully, citing official training manuals and standard curriculum materials. But when pressed for specifics about the nuanced elements of her execution, she mentioned studying published articles by senior officers about lessons learned from recent conflicts. She did not name specific authors, kept her responses professionally vague, but something in her phrasing made General Holloway's attention sharpen. He asked which articles, specifically, which lessons had informed her tactical development most significantly. The question hung in the air, weighted with implication neither fully understood. Kira hesitated for the first time, calculating risks, deciding how much truth to reveal. She mentioned several articles about adaptive infantry tactics, about maintaining initiative through controlled aggression, about using terrain to multiply combat effectiveness. General Holloway recognized his own work in her description, papers he had published years ago about experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, analyses he had written for professional military journals. She had studied his tactical philosophy, absorbed his lessons, implemented his approaches without knowing she might someday present them to him for judgment. The realization created strange cognitive dissonance, pride in seeing his ideas executed while mixing with frustration at their source. The other board members noticed the extended exchange between the general and Lieutenant Brennan, the unusual depth of his questioning, his apparent fascination with her tactical education. Colonel Patterson glanced between them, sensing undercurrents he could not identify, wondering if some prior connection existed that he had not been briefed about. Kira completed her presentation, returned to her seat, waited while the board reviewed supplementary materials and consulted among themselves. Randolph sat rigid with barely contained anger, watching his case potentially disintegrate under the weight of her systematic tactical justification. His complaint had seemed straightforward when filed, clear violation of command structure, obvious grounds for disciplinary action. Now it appeared more complex, raising uncomfortable questions about the balance between following orders and making correct tactical decisions. The board called a recess to deliberate, dismissed both parties to separate waiting areas while they discussed findings and recommendations. Kira walked to the designated room, accepted water from an aide, sat alone with thoughts racing through permutations of possible outcomes. Formal reprimand would damage, but not destroy her career. Anything more severe could derail everything she had worked to build, vindicate her father's original judgment that she lacked whatever quality military service required. Sergeant Major Vasquez appeared in the doorway, checked to ensure they were alone before entering fully. She sat across from Kira, studied her with eyes that had witnessed decades of military service and human complexity. She said nothing for a long moment, just observed, assessed, made some internal calculation about loyalty and truth and timing. Finally, she spoke quietly, asked if Kira understood what she was really facing in that hearing room. Not just Randolph's complaint about insubordination, but the larger question of what kind of officer she intended to become, whether she would continue hiding or eventually claim her full identity. The words carried layers of meaning, suggested knowledge that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. Vasquez continued before Kira could respond. Mentioned that she had served with General Holloway for 15 years, had watched his daughter grow up on various bases before the family split apart. She remembered a determined girl who wanted nothing more than to follow in her father's footsteps, who studied tactics like other children studied fairy tales. She had wondered occasionally what happened to that girl, whether she had pursued her dreams or abandoned them under pressure. Kira met the sergeant major's eyes, found understanding there mixed with gentle challenge. She asked quietly how long Vasquez had known, how she had recognized the connection despite the different surname and years of separation. Vasquez smiled slightly, said that some things could not be hidden from those who knew what to look for, that excellence carried signatures as distinctive as fingerprints for those trained to see them. The board reconvened after 90 minutes of deliberation, calling both parties back to hear their findings. Kira returned to her position with outward calm that concealed the churning anxiety beneath. Sergeant Major Vasquez's words echoed in her mind, the suggestion that hiding carried its own costs, that eventually truth found its way to light regardless of how carefully one tried to contain it. Colonel Patterson read the board's decision with formal precision. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, considering both command structure requirements and tactical necessity, the board found that Lieutenant Brennan's actions, while technically outside strict chain of command protocols, demonstrated sound tactical judgment under rapidly evolving circumstances. Her decisions had achieved mission objectives while minimizing simulated casualties, reflecting the adaptive leadership the exercise was designed to evaluate. The board recommended no disciplinary action against Lieutenant Brennan. Furthermore, they noted that her tactical analysis and mission execution would be incorporated into training materials as examples of effective decision-making under pressure. Captain Randolph would receive counseling about the importance of tactical flexibility and subordinate input in combat situations. Randolph's face flushed dark red, jaw clenched against words he could not afford to speak in official proceedings. He had expected validation, formal recognition that his authority had been violated, consequences that would demonstrate the importance of respecting rank regardless of circumstances. Instead, he received implicit criticism, suggestion that his own leadership had been deficient, public recommendation that he learned from the officer he had tried to discipline. Kira accepted the decision with professional acknowledgement, no visible relief or triumph, just the same measured composure she had maintained throughout. General Holloway dismissed the hearing, remained seated as others filed out, gestured for Kira to stay when she moved to leave. Colonel Patterson and the other board member exchanged glances, but complied with the unspoken request for privacy. The room emptied until only the two of them remained, General and Lieutenant, father and daughter, though only one of them consciously held both identities in mind. Marcus Holloway studied her openly now, freed from the constraints of formal proceedings, allowing himself to really look at the officer before him rather than maintaining judicial distance. He asked about her tactical education again, pressed past the professional vagueness she had offered during testimony. He wanted specifics, wanted to understand how a lieutenant with less than 8 years of service had developed strategic thinking that rivaled officers with twice her experience. His tone carried genuine curiosity rather than interrogation. The voice of a commander identifying exceptional talent and wanting to understand its source. Kira measured her response carefully, still maintaining the barrier between her two identities even as it felt increasingly fragile. She mentioned extensive independent study, reading everything she could find about modern combat operations, analyzing after-action reports and tactical journals. She admitted to focusing particularly on articles about adaptive infantry tactics, finding those perspectives most valuable for understanding how to lead effectively in uncertain conditions. Marcus continued probing, asked which specific authors she had found most influential, which tactical philosophies resonated most strongly with her own developing approach to leadership. The questions felt increasingly personal even in their professional framing, as though he sensed something familiar in her responses without being able to identify exactly what. She answered truthfully without revealing the full truth, mentioned several authors, including some of his own work. She quoted back his own principles about maintaining initiative, about using terrain creatively, about trusting subordinate leaders to execute intent rather than requiring rigid adherence to plans. His words filtered through her voice, his lessons demonstrated through her actions, his legacy living in a soldier he did not recognize. Something shifted in his expression, recognition dawning slowly like sun through heavy clouds. He asked her surname again, her full name, where she had grown up, where her family had served. The questions came faster, connections forming in his mind, even as he resisted conclusions that seemed impossible. Kira felt the moment crystallizing, the choice between continued concealment and confrontation with 8 years of carefully maintained distance. She could deflect again, provide answers that satisfied curiosity without revealing connection. Or she could let the barrier fall, accept whatever consequences came from her father finally seeing who stood before him. The decision was made before she consciously recognized making it. Something in his expression, the genuine interest in understanding her development as an officer, the respect implicit in his questions. She had built her career to earn exactly this kind of recognition, to prove that his initial judgment had been wrong. Now she had it, from the very person whose approval she had claimed not to need. Before she could speak, the mess hall memory surfaced. The evening meal, the casual removal of her outer uniform in the heat, the tattoo she had gotten at 19 after completing basic training. The family military crest her grandfather had worn, her father wore, the symbol of 3 generations of service. She had marked herself with it permanently, claiming the legacy even while hiding the name. The heat wave that had been building for 3 days finally broke over Fort Stevens with oppressive intensity. Temperatures climbed past 95 degrees by mid-morning, turning the base into a sweltering maze of concrete and metal that radiated accumulated warmth. Training schedules adjusted, shifting physically demanding activities to early morning or evening hours, leaving midday for administrative tasks and equipment maintenance. Kira completed her afternoon training session with a group of new recruits, running them through small unit tactics in the limited shade of the northern training area. The session went well despite the heat, the recruits responding to her instruction with the focused attention that came from recognizing competent leadership. She dismissed them with reminders about hydration and heat injury prevention, then headed toward the mess hall for an early dinner. The mess hall offered marginal relief from the outdoor temperature, industrial air conditioning struggling against the heat and the bodies of several hundred soldiers seeking refuge. Kira moved through the serving line mechanically, selected food without much attention to specifics, just fuel to replace what the day's exertion had consumed. She found a table in the back corner, away from the main flow of traffic, set her tray down, and began the process of eating. The meal was halfway finished when she became aware of the heat in the room, the way her uniform clung damply to her skin, the trickle of sweat down her spine that even the air conditioning could not prevent. Without conscious thought, Acting on pure instinct for relief, she removed her outer uniform top. The standard issue tank top beneath was perfectly regulation for the mess hall environment during heat conditions, practical and appropriate. She folded the removed top carefully, set it on the bench beside her, felt immediate relief as air circulation improved against her skin. She picked up her fork again, focused on finishing the meal so she could return to her quarters for actual rest. The conversation around her continued its normal patterns, complaints about the heat mixing with the usual military humor about uncomfortable conditions and bureaucratic responses. The mess hall doors opened somewhere behind her, the brief sound of voices shifting as someone entered. She paid it no attention, just another soldier or officer moving through the evening routine. The background noise continued unchanged, nothing to suggest this moment was different from hundreds of others in her 18 months at Fort Stevens. General Marcus Holloway had not planned to visit the mess hall that evening. His schedule included paperwork and video conferences, the administrative burden that accompanied command regardless of temperature or personal preference. But something had drawn him out of his office, some restless energy that demanded movement and visibility among his soldiers. He entered the mess hall with Sergeant Major Vasquez at his side, the two of them conducting an informal walkthrough, checking on soldier morale and facility conditions during the heat wave. They moved between tables slowly, stopping to speak with various personnel, asking about heat mitigation measures and training adjustments. Vasquez guided their path subtly, making suggestions about which areas to visit, which soldiers might benefit from command attention. She led them gradually toward the back section of the mess hall, toward a specific table where a lieutenant sat alone with her back to their approach. Marcus walked between the rows of tables, his attention divided between the soldiers he greeted and the overall atmosphere of the facility. He was saying something to Vasquez about ensuring adequate water supplies at remote training areas when he passed behind the solitary lieutenant, glancing down automatically as he moved. His words stopped mid-sentence. His forward movement halted so abruptly that Vasquez nearly collided with him. Every thought in his mind crystallized on a single image before him, the tattoo visible on the lieutenant's left shoulder blade, exposed by the tank top, and her current position. The family crest was unmistakable. 3 generations of Holloway service rendered in precise military heraldry, the regimental symbol his grandfather had worn in World War II, that he had inherited and honored throughout his own career. It was not a common design, not something that appeared by coincidence or artistic fancy. It was specific, deliberate, deeply personal to his family line. His breath caught in his throat as understanding crashed through every defense he had constructed. The tactical thinking that echoed his own lessons, the strategic approaches that mirrored his published work, the bearing and discipline that reflected his training philosophy. All of it suddenly making terrible, perfect sense. Kira sensed the presence behind her, felt the weight of focused attention in the way prey animals sense predators. She turned slowly, fork still in hand, looked up to identify whoever had stopped at her table. Her eyes met her father's face, saw recognition there beyond anything tactical or professional, the dawning comprehension of connection she had both feared and unconsciously sought. The noise of the mess hall faded into meaningless static. The distance between them collapsed despite the physical meters separating their positions. 8 years of separation, of carefully maintained anonymity, of proving herself without the weight or advantage of his name. All of it stripped away in a single moment of exposure. Marcus found his voice, barely, the words emerging rough and uncertain. He asked her name, needed to hear it spoken, needed confirmation of what his eyes and memory and heart were telling him must be true. Kira set down her fork with careful precision, maintained her composure through sheer force of will. She answered clearly, voice steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. Lieutenant Kira Brennan, she said, then added after the briefest hesitation, formerly Holloway. The silence stretched between them, father and daughter frozen in recognition, while the mess hall continued its oblivious rhythm around them. Sergeant Major Vasquez stood quietly a few steps back, witness to a reunion 8 years in the making, ready to provide whatever support either of them needed when the initial shock passed. Marcus recovered first, years of command, training overriding personal turmoil, allowing him to function despite the emotional earthquake reshaping his understanding of the past 18 months. He asked quietly if they could speak privately, his voice carrying none of the authority that usually marked his requests, just quiet desperation of a father confronting the daughter he had driven away. Kira nodded, retrieved her uniform top, and pulled it back on despite the heat, needing the armor of complete military bearing for whatever came next. She stood, followed him from the mess hall, aware of eyes tracking their movement, whispers beginning as soldiers noted their general extracting a lieutenant for private discussion. The speculation would spread quickly through base communications, but she could not bring herself to care about rumors when facing something so much larger. They walked in silence to his office, Vasquez trailing at a discreet distance before peeling off to stand guard outside once they entered. Marcus closed the door, gestured toward a chair, then seemed unsure whether military protocol or family relationship should govern this interaction. They stood awkwardly for a moment before both simultaneously moving toward chairs, the synchronization of their movements evidence of shared genetics and training. Marcus sat behind his desk initially, then reconsidered and moved to the chair beside Kira instead, eliminating the barrier of rank and furniture. He looked at her directly, really seeing her for the first time in years, noting how the girl he remembered had become a woman, a soldier, an officer who commanded respect through demonstrated competence. He began with an apology, words he had rehearsed mentally countless times over the years, but never found the courage or opportunity to speak. He told her he had been wrong 8 years ago, wrong to forbid her choice, wrong to issue ultimatums, wrong to let pride and fear destroy what mattered most. His career had taught him many things about leadership and sacrifice, but losing his daughter had taught him the limits of control and the cost of rigidity. Kira listened without interruption, keeping her own emotions carefully contained, not trusting herself to respond until he finished. She had imagined this conversation thousands of times during her service, rehearsed arguments and accusations, prepared defenses against criticism that might come. But his apology disarmed those preparations, left her navigating unfamiliar territory without the protective script she had developed. When he finally paused, waiting for her response, she found words emerging that she had not consciously planned. She told him about watching his career from a distance, reading everything he published, studying his tactics and leadership philosophy. She admitted that every decision she made as an officer was filtered through lessons learned from him, that he had shaped her more profoundly through his absence than he might have through his presence. She explained the choice to use her mother's name, the desire to prove herself without the assumptions that came with being General Holloway's daughter. She had needed to know that her success or failure belonged entirely to her, that no one could attribute her achievements to nepotism or her struggles to inadequacy measured against his legacy. The anonymity had been painful but necessary, a crucible that forged her into the officer she had become. Marcus listened with visible pain, recognizing how much of her development he had missed, how many moments of pride and growth had occurred outside his awareness. He mentioned the hearing, seeing her tactical presentation, recognizing his own lessons reflected in her execution without understanding the connection. The irony cut deeply, that his best student had been learning from him for years while he remained oblivious to her existence in his command. He asked about the tattoo when she had gotten it, what it meant to her to carry the family crest despite using a different surname. Kira touched her shoulder unconsciously, feeling the marked skin beneath her uniform. She had gotten it right after basic training, she told him, on her first week in Liberty. It was her way of honoring the legacy, even while building her own path, claiming connection to 3 generations of service, while proving she could stand among them through merit rather than birthright. The conversation opened slowly, 8 years of separation requiring careful navigation. Old wounds still tender despite time and distance. They talked about her mother, the divorce, the ways that family fracture had affected all of them differently. Marcus admitted guilt about the marriage failing, recognized how his inability to accept Kira's choice had revealed deeper incompatibilities between him and his wife. Kira shared experiences from her training and deployments, moments where his published articles had provided guidance, times when remembering his lessons had made the difference between success and failure. She described the strange intimacy of learning from someone while maintaining distance, knowing him through his work better than she had known him in person during the final years before their split. Marcus asked about her assignment to Fort Stevens, whether she had requested it knowing he commanded there or if coincidence had brought them together. Kira hesitated, then admitted she had requested the transfer deliberately. Drawn by some need, she could not fully articulate to be near him, even while remaining hidden. She had wanted to see the kind of commander he had become, to understand if the father who had rejected her choice had evolved in his thinking about women in combat roles. The conversation extended past midnight, father and daughter gradually rediscovering each other through the lens of military service that had both divided and connected them. Marcus shared his own evolution over the years, how watching female officers excel in combat roles had forced him to confront the assumptions that had driven his initial rejection of Kira's choice. He had been wrong not just about her specifically, but about women in combat generally, a realization that had come too late to repair what his stubbornness had broken. Kira listened to his admission with complex emotions, validating and painful in equal measure. Part of her wanted to hear that he had been wrong about her, specifically her, rather than just wrong in general principle. But she recognized the courage required to admit fundamental error in judgment, to acknowledge that core beliefs had been misguided. It was more than many people managed in a lifetime. They talked about the future, what relationship might be possible now that truth existed between them. Marcus wanted to offer her opportunities immediately, positions on his staff where her talents could be fully utilized. But Kira resisted anything that might appear to be favoritism, that might undermine the independent career she had worked so hard to build. She had earned respect as Lieutenant Brennan, and she was not ready to surrender that identity for the complicated legacy of being General Holloway's daughter. They negotiated a compromise that honored both their needs. She would continue her regular assignments, prove herself through normal channels without special consideration. But they would also be open about their relationship, stop hiding connection that might be discovered anyway. The transparency felt risky after years of secrecy, but also liberating, an acknowledgement that she had nothing left to prove to him or to herself. As dawn approached, Marcus made a request that surprised her. He asked if she would be willing to co-author a paper with him about adaptive leadership and tactical decision-making, using her experiences from Operation Iron Resolve as the case study. It would be published under both their names, Holloway and Brennan, acknowledging the different paths they had taken to reach similar conclusions about effective command. Kira felt something unlock in her chest, some final barrier dissolving. The offer represented everything she had wanted without knowing how to ask for it, recognition and collaboration without obligation or debt. She agreed, understanding that writing together would be its own form of healing, building something new from the pieces of what had been broken. The official results from the hearing arrived later that morning, confirming what Colonel Patterson had announced. Not only was Kira cleared of all charges, but her tactical analysis would become required study for junior officers throughout the base. Captain Randolph received formal counseling and was reassigned to a staff position where his traditional approach to command would cause less friction with evolving military doctrine. Word spread quickly through Fort Stevens about the hearing outcome, but even faster spread rumors about the general and Lieutenant Brennan, the private conversation that had extended through the night, speculation about connections that seemed increasingly obvious in retrospect. Sergeant Major Vasquez neither confirmed nor denied anything, but her knowing expression when asked suggested that some truths had been waiting years to surface. 3 weeks later, the base held its regular evening formation for announcements and recognition. Marcus stood at the front, his command staff arrayed behind him, preparing to acknowledge exceptional performance and present awards earned through various training cycles. The assembled soldiers stood in precise ranks, afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parade ground. Marcus called Kira forward to receive a commendation for her tactical excellence during Operation Iron Resolve, the formal recognition adding to her already impressive service record. She marched to position, accepted the award with professional bearing, shook his hand with the same measured respect she would show any commanding officer. But something passed between them in that handshake, acknowledgement visible to anyone paying close attention, the pride of a father watching his daughter excel. After the formation, Marcus invited his senior staff to an informal gathering at his quarters, one of those mandatory social events that marked military culture. Kira attended, no longer avoiding situations where she might encounter him, no longer calculating exit strategies and defensive conversational tactics. She moved through the gathering with quiet confidence, engaged in discussions about upcoming training exercises and policy updates. At some point during the evening, Marcus found himself in conversation with a group of officers that included Kira. Someone asked about his approach to tactical training, what principles he considered most important for developing junior leaders. He began to answer, then paused and looked at his daughter, invited her to share her perspective as someone currently implementing those lessons in practice. If this story moved you, drop a comment about your favorite moment, or tell us about a time when family found their way back to each other. Kira spoke thoughtfully about the balance between following established doctrine and adapting to unique circumstances, about the importance of understanding principles deeply enough to know when to deviate from standard approaches. Her words echoed themes from his own writings, but filtered through her experiences and expressed in her voice. The other officers listened intently, recognizing wisdom that came from hard-earned understanding rather than theoretical study. Marcus watched her with undisguised pride now, no longer constrained by ignorance or protocol from acknowledging what she had become. She was everything he had hoped to develop in officers under his command, everything the military needed from its future leaders. The fact that she was also his daughter, that her excellence reflected lessons he had taught even in his absence, felt like grace he had not earned, but would accept with gratitude. The evening ended with father and daughter standing together on his quarters porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. They did not speak much, did not need to, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. 8 years had been lost, could not be recovered or relived. But what remained could be built into something new, a relationship forged through mutual respect rather than obligation, through shared commitment to service rather than accident of birth. It was not the same as what had been broken, but perhaps it was better, earned rather than assumed, tested and proven rather than taken for granted. The family crest they both carried, visible and invisible, marked not just legacy inherited, but legacy created, 3 generations becoming 4 through courage and reconciliation.